Okay. I wanted to start with a brief recap of the story I told last time. There's 5 important pieces of conceptual machinery that I put on the table last week that I want to build on this time. So the first one is the idea of a pragmatic metavocabulary. That's a language, a meta-language, that is a language for talking about language, but for talking specifically about the use of the language, about discursive practices. The notion of a meta-language started off, Tarski's notion was the notion of a semantic meta-language. Carnap, thinking of Hilbert, talked about syntactic ones. Semantic meta-languages let you talk about meanings. Pragmatic meta-languages let you talk about the use, the practices of using language. And the second point was the idea that we may need to use normative vocabulary in order to give a pragmatic metavocabulary. Pragmatic metavocabulary may need to essentially depend on normative vocabulary. I didn't really argue for that. I invoked a tradition from Kant through Frege to Wittgenstein and on up to Kripke's Wittgenstein, pointed us at a literature about that. I didn't really argue for that. We can think of that as a meta-theoretic, methodological commitment that I'm undertaking. I'm going to be developing normative pragmatic metavocabularies. And the third idea then was that we should use a two-sorted normative pragmatic metavocabulary. Instead of just having some binary opposition, is that appropriate or inappropriate? Is that correct or incorrect? That there are substantial expressive benefits to having a two-sorted deontic vocabulary. And I suggested 2 of those that I'm employing. They're not exactly intertranslatable, but usually you can transfer what's said in the one idiom into the other. And that's, for official purposes, the notion of commitment and entitlement, and unofficially in motivating that, talking about responsibility and authority. Fourth point was using that preferred idiom of commitment and entitlement. I talked about how practices of assertion are intimately tied up with practices of reasoning, that making a claim is essentially doing something that involves undertaking the responsibility to offer reasons entitling you to that commitment, at least if you're appropriately challenged. That is, if someone gives makes a claim that offers a reason against what you said, well, then your entitlement to that commitment is put at risk. And to redeem it, you need to give reasons for it. Now, secondarily, one way of redeeming that entitlement, vindicating that entitlement, is to invoke someone else's testimonial authority, the authority of their assertion. But the claim was entitlements can't all be handed around just by testimony. There has to be another way of redeeming them by reasons. And in connection with that story about how practices of asserting and practices of rationally defending and rationally challenging by giving reasons by giving reasons for and reasons against are all part of one package. so that assertion can really be thought of as essentially a move in a practice or a game of giving and asking for reasons. And in connection with that sketch of discursive practice, I recommended thinking of having that structure as what makes a practice a specifically discursive practice. And in connection with that, I sang the praises of a default and challenge structure of commitment and entitlement, whereby merely undertaking the commitment, making the assertion, brings with it a default entitlement, which is fragile, defeasible. It can immediately be challenged by giving an incompatible claim, but that it's essential that in order that we not be patsies for skepticism, that we do think of entitlements as something that come with assertions until and unless they're appropriately challenged. And then the fifth point, which I'd already raised in the introduction 2 weeks ago, is the Harman point. I mean, Harman makes a lot of points, but I will call this the Harman point. Distinguishing practices of inferring as a kind of doing from the relation of implication. He's thinking about deductive implication relations, logical implication relations. But the point is more general. It's not specifically about logic. It's about distinguishing relations of implication and, as I'll particularly emphasize today, incompatibility from the practices that they, in some sense, normatively govern. Now, in the second part of my presentation today, I'll look at John McFarlane's criteria of adequacy for having an adequate account of the sense in which reason relations of implication or of incompatibility normatively govern our practices. But I'll only get to that at the end. So the 5 things to keep in mind to take away from last week: the idea of a normative, the idea of a pragmatic metavocabulary, the idea it should be a normative pragmatic metavocabulary, the recommendation that we get a substantial expressive power, expressive dividends from having a genuinely two-dimensional deontic pragmatic metavocabulary, two-dimensional in that we use two notions that are not interdefinable. They're independent of one another in the sense of not being reducible to one another. And then a sketch of the way in which practices of undertaking a commitment by assertion go hand in hand with, essentially involve the idea of vindicating one's entitlement to that commitment, if appropriately challenged, by rationally defending it with reasons, and this Harman point of the distinction between really act and content, I think, inferring and relations of implication. Now, what I want to do today is deepen that discussion by looking at relations among these. But before I do that, maybe I should just stop and ask whether there are questions or comments about those 5 points insofar as I've put them on the table so far, granting that we're going to have a lot more to say about them. Anything anybody wants to point to or ask about? Yes, Taylor.
Yeah, I was wondering about it's the third point, C on the handout. Um, so we say, okay, it can't just be a one-dimensional binary deontic status. We need two. Is there something to be said for moving instead of moving to two dimensions to changing the binariness of the deontic status? So using a single dimension of deontic status, but having it be gradable in some capacity.
Gradable rather than say having three of them. I don't know. I mean, that would be doing different work than the two dimensionality is doing. But I suppose if we think about commitment as graded, doxastic commitment is graded, basically what you get is credences. And we know you get a lot for thinking in those terms. So yeah, that's a reason to think that is that intermediate? I don't think it's an intermediate move. It's a different move. But one might then want to combine that dimension with the two dimensionality and think not just about graded commitments, but graded entitlements. That's not something that Bayesianism or the rational choice framework does. There's really only one. Well, I don't know. I mean, we have both the probabilities and the credences, both the preferences and the probabilities corresponding to credences. Yeah, maybe we really do have two dimensions there. I haven't really thought through what the relations are between the framework that I'll be laying out and that way of relaxing the assertable, not assertable tradition. So, yeah, good thought. Hassan?
Yeah, so maybe I'm rushing ahead here. I'm just not I don't have it all together. So the 5 points here, I understand them as sort of represented in the second sort of diagram you introduced last week, where pragmatics is doing explanatory work for content or for semantics. I guess one thing I'm struggling to get is that one thing you mentioned in the first week is that with respect to the pragmatic to semantic order of explanation and the possible semantic to pragmatic order of explanation, we want to like avoid having to choose between them, instead focusing on like reasons to sort of understand them together. How is this just understanding one side of that, the pragmatic, this just understanding the pragmatic to semantic direction? I'm not sure how it fits together.
Yeah, I mean, your initial thought was right that this is sort of
okay
where we're going, but the picture here is let's look at and we want to look at the relations between the two sides that Harman distinguishes. Let's look at the relations between the discursive practices that are pragmatic metavocabulary lets us specify, and the reason relations, as I'm calling them, of implication and, I'll argue, of equal status, incompatibility. What are the relations between them? And we'll look to one program for understanding the reason relations in terms of the discursive practices, and that's bilateralism. And that's roughly the sort of the first half of today. And in the second half, we'll look at the other direction. That is, how can we understand the reason relations as normatively governing the discursive practices, setting standards for assessment of doing that right. And the inferentialist semantic program says, if you give me the reason relations, I'll give you the meanings. We'll think about meanings, about contents, about propositional contents in terms of the roles that things play as claimables play as premises and conclusions of implications, as things that can be incompatible with one another. But we'll see from a semantics first order of explanation, if you start with the example we'll focus on, Fine's truth maker, false maker semantics, he has another way of specifying those reason relations. Sort of the first and most important thing he needs truth makers and false makers for is to define a notion of consequence. And there's a notion of incompatibility as well. And that's going to be metaphysically grounded. And I'll claim that we can look at a metavocabulary for reason relations and see that as amphibious between the pragmatics and the semantics. That's some weeks down the line, but that's where we're going to sort of higher inferentialism. Understand your semantics and metaphysical representational terms. If you like, there's still going to be this core of reason relations that we can approach either from the pragmatics or the semantics. So that's where we're aiming.
So just to clarify, the reason relations, it's not that they're not a creature of either pragmatics or semantics doing explanatory work for both. It's that you can understand them through like sort of each perspective or whatever.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. So as I started to say here, I want to think about the relations between the two things that Harman distinguishes: the practices of asserting and inferring, defending and challenging, by producing more assertings that are reasons stand in relations of reasons for and reasons against, on the one hand, and the reason relations, paradigmatically implication or consequence relations between assertables. And I think about those as relations. I think about the assertions, the commitments and entitlements, those statuses, as sort of positions in the assertional game, in the game of giving and asking for reasons, and the inferring, the giving a reason for, giving a reason against, defending, challenging. Those are the moves that one can make. And the reason relations, which hold not between the acts or statuses, but between the assertables or the claimables, as I'll say, ultimately between the contents that are expressed by the declarative sentences that you use to give reasons, make assertions, and so on. And so first I want to look at one program for moving from the practices to the reason relations. The way the bilateralists think about it is they're giving us a pragmatic account of what it means to say that some premise set gamma implies a conclusion A. We can write that if you look at the bottom of page 2 of the handout. We can write gamma implies A. There's that funny snake turnstile. I use that to indicate its substructurality. We'll start talking about that next week. But we can write that, A is a consequence of the premise set gamma or is implied by it. But what does that mean? What does it mean to say that that reason relation holds? And the bilateralists are going to give us an account of that in a normative pragmatic metavocabulary. And so one way of thinking about this is the reason relations articulate what Sellers called the space of reasons. The space of reasons is reasons as standing in relations of consequence or incompatibility, relations of being a reason for or reason against other contents. And we're asking, what's the relation between the space of reasons that is invoked in thinking about Davidson as well as about Sellers, that looms large in John McDowell's work? What's the relation between the space of reasons and the game of giving and asking for reasons, or practices of making claims and challenging and defending them? And I want to tell that part of the story in two parts. I want to look at Restall-Ripley bilateralism, which is a view that looms large in contemporary philosophy of logic, but that in fact is addressing reason relations more generally. It doesn't have to be logical consequence that they're giving an account of, though that's what they're focusing on. And look at their normative pragmatic account of what it means to say that a reason relation holds, that an implication holds. And then second, I want to show in the second part of my discussion of this move, I want to show how we can add a further level of fine structure to that bilateralist account by rendering it in an explicitly deontically two-dimensional pragmatic metavocabulary of commitment and entitlement, which their account invites, but doesn't actually give us. And then in part, so that's basically going to be an account of the first arrow in the mandala of metavocabularies of reason, the one that goes from the pragmatics vertex to the inner triangle of reason relations. And then in the second part, after the break, I'm thinking we'll look at McFarlane basically worrying about the arrow that would go in the other direction, saying, suppose you give me these meaning relations, give me a consequence relation, you tell me that B follows from A, or that A implies B. Now, what does that mean about what I'm allowed to do normatively? And he has a very carefully worked out account of what the space of possibilities is for answers of that. That article of his has been very influential. And I want to then use that as the measure of success of the account of the deepened bilateralism. So the two bits of influential contemporary philosophy, each of which has a significant literature around it that we'll talk about, is the bilateralist account of consequence relations and McFarlane's question. You know, he says turns out to be surprisingly difficult to say what the normative significance of a consequence claim is. So that'll be moving from the pragmatics to the reason relations, and then seeing how the reason relations inform the pragmatics. So the Restall and Ripley bilateralism and this problematic of Macfarlane's. Okay. Okay. So the basic idea that Restall Ripley, this is Greg Restall and Dave Ripley. Restall just recently moved to St. Andrews. And Dave Ripley is still in Monash. They're both Australians. We'll come across them again when we look at logic and contrast what they call negation on the Australian plan and negation on the American plan. And the original idea is Restall's in the article that I put in the supplementary reading for today. Ripley, who is one of Restall's students, applied that to thinking about the semantic paradoxes. And I'll mention something in passing about that really later on. But the first observation of theirs is that there's a fundamental bivalence in speech acts and the attitudes that they express. One can assert, but one can also deny. The assertion expresses a practical attitude of accepting a claimable, and the denial expresses a practical attitude of rejecting it. Restall and Ripley just talk about assertion and denial because they want everything to be out in the public light of day of our doings, and they don't want to have any commerce with potentially spooky inner attitudes. But I don't think these practical attitudes are mysterious, and I'm perfectly happy to keep two sets of books on the practical attitude and the expression of it. So we can line up assertion as expressing acceptance, denial as expressing rejection. These are the pragmatic analog of the semantic bivalent relation between truth and falsity, between the two truth values, with which semantics first orders of explanation begin. And we can see a connection between these because accepting a claimable, that is something that can be asserted or denied, accepting a claimable, we can paraphrase that as taking it true, as taking true that claimable, taking it to be true. And we can paraphrase rejection, what's expressed by denial of a claimable, as taking false. And in a semantics first order of explanation, one might give an account of truth and falsity first. Fine, we'll say the beginning of the semantics is to talk about what it is for some state of the world to be a truth maker for a claim, so that if the state is actual, then the claim is true, or to be a false maker for it. One of the reasons that we'll be talking about the truth-making framework as our semantic model is, I think, also one of the reasons that it's been so successful, this hyperintentional truth-maker framework, is that it's genuinely two-dimensional. It says, don't think that you can do with just truth making or false making, and define the one in terms of the other. You need two potentially independent notions, but in a semantics first order of explanation, which is something like what the tradition has worked with since Frege. You get some sort of a grip on truth and falsity, and that's your route to understanding the practical attitudes of taking true and taking false. But in a pragmatics first order of explanation, one's going to start with assertion and denial, acceptance and rejection, and on down the line, we'll look for what illumination we might get about notions of truth or falsity, exploiting the idea that accepting is taking true, but thinking if we can get an independent grip on accepting what's expressed by asserting, that then we can get a handle on true as what we're taking things to be, the property that we're taking them to have when we accept or assert. So the bivalence with which the bilateralists begin is basically the same bivalence with which the semantic tradition begins. It's just they're going to focus on the pragmatic side rather than the semantic side of it. So bilateralism is going to be a strategy for a pragmatics first order of explanation. And their second idea is that bivalence is the key to understanding the reason relation of implication. This is the really deep idea that they had, and I think it's a new idea, that the bipolarity, that the bivalence that shows up in the opposition between assertion and denial corresponds to the two sides of the implication relation. That's the bilateralism, they call it. Latera are the sides. So if we have our turnstile expressing the reason relation of implication, as I say, for reasons that'll be clear later, I use the funny snake turnstile, but it doesn't matter what we use. They're saying that opposition between assertion and denial, acceptance and rejection, corresponds to the two sides of the implication relation, to the premises and the conclusion. That the premise side of an implication relation is associated with assertion or acceptance, and the conclusion side is associated with denial, with rejection. Now, obviously, a lot turns on what associated with means, I mean, how we fill in that notion. But as I say, this was an original idea, and I think it's a genuinely deep idea to line up assertion and denial with the two sides of the implication relation. I say I think this is a deep idea. Well, we're going to be sort of digging down, excavating, sort of following out that depth. I hope to convince you that this is a deep and important idea. We'll see over on the when Ulf Lobel's isomorphism result gives us a route to move back and forth between pragmatic bilateralism and Fine's truthmaker framework, we'll see that this corresponds to thinking of consequence in terms of the truth of the premises and the falsity of the conclusion. Now, that's not an idea that Fine has, even though I'll argue that that's actually the key to seeing what Fine's achievement is. But just bracket that thought. I'm not today going to be talking about the true-false version of that. But the key connection between the premise side and assertion and the conclusion side and denial is not obvious. This was a hard idea, but it's really important. So the way they're connected is to treat assertion and denial bivalently. Each of them is one of a pair of speech acts, attitudes, along with assertion goes with denial, acceptance with rejection. To treat the implication turnstile bilaterally, to think about the position you're in if you assert all the premises and deny the conclusion. And they call that a position. It's a constellation of, I'm going to say, commitments to accept and commitments to reject. Those attitudes are themselves normative statuses of the commitment kind. And then the third element of Restall-Ripley bilateralism is to use a global or holistic normative binary to apply to those positions. And what they say is, gamma implies A, says that the position you're in, if you assert all the premises and deny the conclusion, is out of bounds. That's a bad position. You've made a mistake. And what you should do is try and get back in bounds. But in keeping with the Harman point, the implication doesn't tell you how to do that. All the implication says is that if you find yourself asserting all of the premises and denying the conclusion, you're out of bounds and so are normatively obliged to do something to get back in bounds. So what the reasons relations tell us is how to distinguish between constellations of attitudes that are in bounds or out of bounds. They use that global normative assessment. I'm going to paraphrase that by saying that a position is a constellation of commitments. In the case where we have an implication relation, the position we care about is a set of commitments to accept all the premises, and the set of combined with the set of commitments to reject the conclusion, and that being out of bounds is saying you can't be entitled to those commitments. They're inbounds, out of bounds. I'm going to say inbounds, think of entitlement, but now to the whole holistic set of commitments. And being out of bounds is, well, you can't be entitled to all of those. So I'm going to take over all those ideas, in particular those three, to think about the bivalence of acts and attitudes: assertion, denial, acceptance, rejection, understanding the implication relation bilaterally in terms of these two sides, and then applying a normative assessment, a binary normative assessment, inbounds, out of bounds, entitled, not entitled, to the whole constellation of commitments. I'll say to the whole position that you've adopted, they say. Now, I'm going to have more things to say about consequences of this, but the first thing to see about it is they're offering an explanation in a normative pragmatic metavocabulary of what the reason relation of implication or consequence is. They're saying we can define that, what it is for gamma to imply A, just is for the position that anybody's in if they assert all of gamma and deny A to be out of bounds. That's what we're going to mean by saying that A follows from gamma, or is a consequence of gamma, or is implied by gamma. That last is a reason relation. It's the sort of thing that we semantic inferentialists are then going to use and say, oh, give me those, and I can tell you what propositional contents are. But this is an account in a normative, in a pragmatic metavocabulary of assertion and denial, the way they have it, which is something you do in the practice. It's a normative pragmatic metavocabulary because we've got inbounds and out of bounds here. And it's bilateral because it uses the bivalent relation between assertion and denial and lines those up with the two sides of the implication relation, the premise side and the conclusory side. So the most important thing to see about it, I'm saying, is that it's an account of what a reason relation is, what that turnstile is expressing, what we mean by saying that one set of claimables implies another in a normative pragmatic metavocabulary. So let me stop there. Do you see how this is supposed to work? A few years ago, there was a big collection from Oxford University Press called The Concept of Logical Consequence, sort of asking, what do we mean by logical consequence? And bilateralism, I think, gave by far the best answer to that question. There are a number of the essays in there taking a bilateralist point of view. And they had a straightforward sort of, here's what we mean by logical consequence, in a way that I think the rival theories can't match. Let me mention 2 points in the vicinity of this bilateralism. The first is, what do Restall and Ripley want it for? And this is something that they wanted for different reasons. And let me mention Restall first, and then Ripley. So we will hear a lot more about what I'm about to wave my hands very generally at in our two weeks on logic. But the logic we're going to be concerned about is sequent calculi that were invented by Gensen, which is what happens when you take a statement like gamma implies A. He called that a sequent. It says one thing follows from another. Sequel follows. And you treat those as mathematical objects. Treat those implication statements as mathematical objects and see how you can manipulate them. A sequent calculus is a set of meta-inferential principles. Meta-inferential in that they say, if this is a good sequent, then so is this other one. Or if this collection of sequence holds, then so does this other one. So for instance, a meta-inferential principle in a sequent calculus might tell you that if A turnstile B is good and B turnstile C is good, then A turnstile C is good. That's a meta-inferential principle of transitivity. So Gensen formulated logic in the form of sequent calculi. And as I say, in a couple of weeks, we'll talk more about these. I'll tell you everything you need to know about them, fear not. But one of the astonishing features of Gensen's sequent calculi formulations of logic is in the battle between classical logicians and intuitionistic logicians. They had focused on the very different treatments of negation in the two settings. So notoriously, you don't have the law of excluded middle in intuitionism. The treatment of the conditional is different. And law of excluded middle is about disjunction as well as negation. They said, well, there are these particular features of what rules hold for the connectives. That's the way people had thought about the opposition between classical and intuitionist logic, which for most of the 20th century were the two rivals. People argued which is the correct logic. A bad question, I will argue later on, but it much exercised people. But they thought it's the rules for the connective. It's how we understand negation, disjunction. That's where the dispute is. And the astonishing feature of Gensen's sequent calculus formulation is he uses the same rules for the connectives. The same set of meta-inferences are used to introduce all the propositional connectives. And he gets classical logic in one formulation and intuitionistic logic in the other formulation. And the only difference between them is whether you allow more than one conclusion on the right side of the turnstile. If you only allow a single conclusion on the right side of the turnstile, then his connective definitions defining the connectives, paradigmatically negation and the conditional, in terms of meta-inferences involving sequence with them, his connectives if you restrict yourself to a single conclusion, gives you intuitionism. But if you allow multiple conclusions on the right side, those very same connective definitions give you classical logic. So this suggested that the difference between them was in the turnstile, not in the connective definitions. And that was a huge conceptual shift in thinking about the difference between these logics. And we've learned a tremendous amount from that shift in perspective. And this is something that, when we actually are focusing on logic in a couple of weeks, I'll talk about some more. But right from the beginning, there have been questions about so if you only allow one conclusion, the jargon for that is it's a single succedent system. So we have the sequent is like gamma turnstile A, and if A, only a sentence, not a set of sentences, can go on the right, that's a single succedent, called the conclusion, the succedent of the sequent. The other is the antecedent of the sequent. Single succedent implication, people sort of thought, okay, you can draw this conclusion. I sort of understand that. But multi-succedent sequence, what does that really mean? If we say gamma turnstile A comma B, and we can think of gamma as just, it's normally set up with a bunch of commas separating the sentences in it. Well, on the left, in the premise side, the comma just means and the rules for conjunction show that. But in the multi-succedent one, the comma is disjunctive. If you have gamma turnstile A comma B, that means that either gamma implies A or gamma implies B. And philosophers of logic, looking at multi-succedent schemes, said, I don't really understand those multi-succedent conclusions. That's not the way we reason. We reason to single conclusions. So Restall is a believer in the sequent calculus and in classical logic. So he's a believer in multi-succedent implication. Bilateralism was his way of explaining to people who don't understand it what that conclusion means. So if you look at the very bottom of page 2 on the handout, gamma implies delta. The set of sentences gamma implies the set of sentences delta. Means on the bilateralist account, anyone who asserts all the elements of gamma and denies all the elements of delta is out of bounds. Bilateralism gets the effect of the comma on the left being conjunctive and the comma on the right being disjunctive by having a universal quantifier, but there's a sort of implicit negation in the denial side. And that De Morgan turns, denying all of delta is disjunctive. To deny all of them, only one of them has to be true. Only one of them has to be rejected. Restall could say, I can give you a uniform explanation of single succedent and multi-succedent implications. It's assertion on the left and denial on the right. It's asserting everything on the left and denying everything on the right. In effect, saying everything on the left is true and not everything on the right is true, or something on the right is false. That's the disjunctive version. If you assert every element of gamma and deny every element of delta, then you're out of bounds. So from Restall's point of view, bilateralism gave him a way of making good sense, demonstrably good sense of multi-succedent sequence in exactly the same terms that he could do single succedent sequence. So that was a bombshell in the philosophy of logic to have an account like that. That's why Restall cared about it. His student Ripley cared about it because he was concerned with the semantic paradoxes, and he wanted to say, if we look at the lyre, we see that from the lyre, we can see that there's an argument that the lyre implies its own negation, and the negation of the lyre implies the lyre. I'm not going to walk through the argument for it. It's a couple of steps in a sequent calculus. And he wants to say both of those are good. Understand them bilaterally. And the conclusion you come to is, if you either assert or deny the lyre, this very sentence is false, you're going to be out of bounds. So the only way to be in bounds is neither to assert nor to deny the lyre. And that is compatible with accepting both of the implications. The lyre implies its negation, and the negation of the lyre implies the lyre. You can accept both of those implications in the bilateralist sense, and you've still got the option of neither asserting nor denying the lyre. That's the only way you won't be out of bounds. And he thought that was a good solution to the lyre. I'm waving my hands over what you can imagine is a very intricate and sophisticated discussion, but that's roughly how it goes. Okay, so that's one sort of side comment, I don't know, placing the bilateralism in philosophical space. Neither of those motivations has anything to do with what I'm going to go on to do with bilateralism. So, I'm saying this to acknowledge it. Some of these issues will come up later when we talk about logic. The other thing is, you'll see I've been careful to talk about Restall-Ripley bilateralism, RR bilateralism. I sometimes abbreviate it here. That's because it's not the only bilateralist game in town. There also is Smiley-Rumfitt bilateralism. Rumfitt was Smiley's student. This Ian Rumfitt, and Locus Classicus for him is his recent book, The Boundary Stones of Thought, which is his philosophy of logic book that works in this other bilateralist tradition. Now, Smiley and Rumfitt found themselves in the following uncomfortable position. They thought that the sequent calculus was the right way to do logic. They were committed to classical logic being the correct logic. And they took it that multiple succedent sequence were unintelligible. And the trouble is, the original Gensen result was you get classical logic in a sequent calculus if and only if you allow multiple conclusions. But they wanted classical logic They had independent grounds to think that was right, and they couldn't make any sense of multiple succedent sequence. And yet they thought sequent calculus was the right way to formulate things. And what Smiley realized, and Rumfitt developed this thought, is if you associate a valence with each premise and each conclusion, well, they want to do it in a single succedent case, so, and the conclusion. If instead of just having P1 through Pn turnstile Q, if each one of those comes with a plus or a minus that says whether you accept it or reject it, whether you assert it or deny it, and so does the conclusion, that they can get a single succedent version of classical logic. They call this bilateral because they're building in explicit acknowledgement of the bivalence of each of the claims. But it's not really, though they use the term bilateralism because it sort of starts in the same place that Restall and Ripley do, it's not really bilateralism in that the polarities are associated with the particular sentences rather than with the two sides of the turnstile. So proper bilateralism, Restall-Ripley bilateralism, says the bivalence goes with the turnstile. One side is the assertion side, and the other side is the denial side. And Smiley and Rumfitt associated the bivalence with each sentence. So in Smiley-Rumfitt scheme, it makes sense to talk about a premise set that is asserting some things and denying others. Whereas in Restall-Ripley bilateralism, the premises are all ones you accept. They can't make any sense of you're having as premises of an implication some things that you deny. Denial is only on the other side of the turnstile. So there's a lively debate in the philosophy of logic about these two ways of going. It was a remarkable achievement of Smiley and Rumfitt to get a single succedent sequent calculus that gives you classical logic. So they showed that going bivalent really does give you something that you didn't have before. And if you are concerned with understanding the significance of that original Gensen result, single succedent sequent calculus will give you intuitionism, and a multi-succedent sequent calculus will give you classical logic with the very same rules for connectives. If you want to understand that, then you really need to worry about, you really need to think hard about this Smiley-Rumfitt result. Now, we're not actually going to worry about that when we get to logic, but I wanted you to our discussion of logic. We're not going to worry about the Smiley-Rumfitt version, but I wanted you to know it existed, and to put the Restall-Ripley bilateralism into philosophical context in this way. Okay, so having said that Restall cares because of multi-succedent, and in a way, so do Smiley and Rumfitt. I don't propose to say anything more about that. That's just for contexting. But let me stop there in case there's some question that was raised by that. I say that I'm writing roughshod over really intricate discussions, but I hope you get the general lie of the land there. Okay, then I want to go on and deepen the bilateralist account by putting it explicitly in a deontically two-dimensional context of commitments and entitlements. And let me say at this point that where I hope I sufficiently fairly advertised that the logic we're going to look at is due to Dan Kaplan and Ulf Lobel, and the semantic treatment is due to them as well. So that in our book, this pragmatic part is the only part that I'm seriously responsible for. And here, there is another one of our role group, the logic group, the Research on Logical Expressivism, Ryan Simonelli, just defended his dissertation in philosophy at the University of Chicago, who is the one who taught me about how to think about these bilateralist issues. And though the way he goes in his own thinking, and in particular in his dissertation, is a Smiley-Rumfit version, whereas I'm going to push the rest all. I couldn't at this point separate which ideas were Ryan's and which were mine in thinking about how to extend the Restall-Ripley bilateralism in the way I'm going to suggest. We've just been talking about this for years, and this is what came out of it. We'll read a piece and recite an argument of Ryan's about a completely different topic later on, actually next week. Okay. The logical tradition has not sufficiently appreciated that in addition to implication or consequence, there's another similarly fundamental and equally irreducible reason relation, namely incompatibility, or its generalization is incoherence of a set of propositions. I gestured earlier at the distinction between doing negation on the Australian plan and doing it on the American plan. Roughly doing it on the Australian plan is understanding negation in terms of incompatibility rather than the other way around. And the basis for my variant of the Restall-Ripley bilateralism is the notion of incompatibility. And this, which, as I say, it and implication are co-eval and co-equal, I want to say. This is hidden in traditional logic because a series of technical tricks let people notationally encode incompatibility in the consequence relation. So, for instance, in Tarski's 1930s paper on the concept of logical consequence, he's able to introduce negation and deal with that because he can use as a substitute for the notion of a set being incoherent. So every element of it is incompatible with the rest of it, saying, oh, that's what you get if the consequence of that set is the whole language. So an incoherent set, in his setting, an inconsistent set, is just one that has the whole language as its consequence. That is, he used explosion to encode incoherence or incompatibility in the consequence relation. And Gensen, in the single set, well, in both systems, uses the notational conceit of an empty right-hand side. He says, if a premise set has, if the sequent that has gamma on the left, the turnstile, and nothing on the right, if that's a good sequent, then gamma is incoherent, and in both intuitionism and classical logic, everything follows from it. So if gamma implies nothing, then you can throw anything in on the right side, and that sequent will be a consequence of the original sequent. That meta inference will be a good one. Now, those are notational conveniences. It means they can just work with one turnstile. I'm going to use the pound sign in place of the turnstile to mark incompatibility. But incompatibility is the paradigm of a case where we see the expressive dividends paid by deontic two-dimensionalism as opposed to a merely binary scheme. Originally in Making It Explicit, I define two claims A and B as incompatible in deontic scorekeeping terms, in a pragmatic metavocabulary, if commitment to one precludes entitlement to the other. This is genuinely two-dimensional. It depends on commitment and entitlement not being interdefinable. Incompatibility is a demonstration of what two-dimensionalism gets you. It lets you define another kind of implication relation. And I exploited this in my Locke lectures in Between Saying and Doing. You can treat one sentence as incompatibility entailing, say, another, just in case everything that's incompatible with the consequent is incompatible with the antecedent. So Pedro is a donkey implies Pedro is a mammal, in the sense that everything incompatible with Pedro being a mammal, for instance, being a prime number or not having a spine, not being a vertebrate, everything incompatible with Pedro being a mammal is incompatible with Pedro being a donkey. And that's a particularly strong kind of entailment. And in Between Saying and Doing, I use that to interpret modally robust implications, necessitated implications. Now, this notion of incompatibility plays a particularly important role in thinking of the game of giving and asking for reasons. It emphasizes the difference, the structural difference between commitments and entitlements. Commitments are atomistic. I can take one on and give it up by asserting or by denying. And you can't stop me from, for instance, undertaking inconsistent commitments. I claim that the single colored swatch is blue, and I claim it's red. And there I am. Those are incompatible claims. So being committed to the one means I can't be entitled to the other. So I'm not entitled to either of them, but I can still commit myself to them. In this normative framework, this is how we can understand people having incompatible beliefs. That's incompatible commitments. They're not entitled to both of them, but so be it. But entitlement isn't like that. Entitlement is a holistic matter. You have to look at all your commitments in order to know whether you're entitled to any of them. Because even though I may have been, say, default entitled to this claim, if I'm also committed to something incompatible with it, that undercuts the commitment. I might otherwise have been able to testimonially inherit entitlement to a claim that you asserted from you. You licensed me to reassert it by asserting it. Your entitlement was in principle heritable by me, but it's a two-phase process. One, do I have a prima facie entitlement, either by default, by testimony, or because I've given a reason? But then second, we have to test whether that prima facie entitlement gets undercut by commitment to something incompatible. So if we think about implication as a matter of commitment inheritance, if you're committed to the premises, you're committed to the conclusion, we'd say, oh, well, there's a variant of that, which is entitlement preserving implications, where if you're committed and entitled to the premises, then you're entitled to the conclusion. This would be a sort of analog, if you think of commitment preserving implications as an analog of deductive logical relations. Then entitlement preserving implications would be an analog of inductive or abductive implications. But all you can inherit that way is a prima facie entitlement. Because if you're committed to something incompatible with that conclusion, then you're not entitled to that conclusion anymore. The incompatibles undercut it. It's this feature of entitlement, the global or holistic character of assessments of entitlement, that is expressed in the Restall-Ripley bilateralism by saying you have to assess the whole position to see whether it's in bounds or out of bounds. Because we're looking at whether you can be entitled to all those commitments. They don't use commitment and entitlement talk, but that's the way I'll paraphrase what they say. So implicitly, I want to say, this notion of incompatibility, where one commitment can preclude entitlement to another, this is implicitly the motor of Restall-Ripley bilateralism. And mind you, it's incompatibility that articulates the critical dimension of practices of giving and asking for reasons. If you claim that Q, and I ask you why, and you give a reason for it, you say, well, P, and that's a good reason for it if P implies Q. But if you say Q and I challenge it by giving a reason against it, I say, but R. Well, that reason against it is something that's incompatible with it. If you're committed to R, you can't be entitled to P if they're incompatible. That's what it means. The incompatible reason relations of incompatibility stand to reasons against, and so to speech acts of challenging, as implications stand to reasons for and practices of defending, of rationally defending your claim. That's why you have to have both kinds of reason relations. The one inform reasons for that you use to justify your claims, to defend them against challenges, but it's the it's incompatibility that defines reasons against. A reason against is an incompatible commitment, which it won't matter if you're not entitled to the incompatible commitment, but if you are, then you can't be entitled to, that commitment precludes entitlement to the thing it's a reason against. So incompatibility relations are needed in any practice that has this critical rational structure, that you can challenge someone's commitment, remove their prima facie entitlement by making an incompatible claim, and then we have to argue about, well, which one of these is one entitled to, the reason against or what it's a reason against. In the draft of chapter 1, I quote from this wonderful essay by Hugh Price called Why Not? Why do we need negation? Which is really an argument in favor of incompatibility. And he imagines what it would be like if there were discursive practices that were purely dogmatic, in that you could only give reasons for claims, but there were no incompatibilities in it. He's, in asking why not, he's using the principle that the way we make explicit incompatibilities is by introducing negations. And we'll talk about that when we talk about logic, in the way you make explicit implications is to introduce conditionals. That's where we're going with logic. But really what he's talking about is what it would be like if you had dogmatists who couldn't be critical, couldn't give reasons against. And he offers this nice dialogue. Me, Fred's in the kitchen. And I start to go off to the kitchen. You, wait, Fred's in the garden. Me, I see, but he's in the kitchen, so I'll go there. And I set off. You lack understanding. The kitchen is Fred free. Me, is it really? But Fred's in it, and that's the important thing. And I leave for the kitchen. If you're a dogmatist, if you can't give reasons against, I say Fred's in the kitchen, and you say, wait, Fred's in the garden. If that's not incompatible, okay, then I'm going to reason the same way I was before. I see, but he's in the kitchen, so I'll go there. No, you lack understanding. The kitchen is Fred free. Is it really? But that's not incompatible with him being in the kitchen if I'm a dogmatist. So in a much less theoretically laden framework, Price is arguing, look, this critical function, you've got to have this collision possible, one claim ruling out another. Well, ruling out entitlement. You can undertake these incompatible commitments. It's just you lose the entitlement to them. And look, this is the idea behind Shannon information theory. But before we get quantitative about how much information there is in a signal, he says the information content of a signal is how much it cuts down the alternatives that you had before you received the signal. So you had a bunch of options, you get the signal, one if by land, two if by sea. You see there's one lantern there. Okay, now then that means we mount up to a horse. The information is a matter of it cutting down, ruling out some of the alternatives. Before you got the message, you were entitled to any of these. Once you get the message, you're only entitled to some of them. The message is incompatible with some of the alternatives you had before, and its information content consists in what it rules out. As I say, that's before we go binary and say, and a bit is one that cuts in half. Okay. Now, I've talked about two sorts of bipolarity. The bivalence of assertion and denial, or acceptance and rejection, or as far as that goes, truth and falsity, reflections in a glass darkly of this pragmatic bivalence. But now I've talked about a bipolarity of reason relations. There's implication and there's incompatibility. What's the relation between those two pairs? Between the bivalence of acts and attitudes on the one hand, and the two flavors of reason relation on the other hand. I said implication lines up with reasons for, incompatibility with reasons against. Well, the connection is that reasons for are reasons to assert, and reasons against are reasons to deny. So there's an intimate connection between the bivalent statuses, the acts and attitudes on the one hand, and these two flavors of reason relation on the other. So if you look at the proposal at the bottom of page 3, gamma implies A, gamma turnstile A, says that commitment to accept all the elements of gamma, all the premises, precludes entitlement to reject A. I'm just doing this single succedent. You'll see that you can tell how one would do a multi-succedent. That's implication. But now in the same terms, we can do what Restall and Ripley didn't do and explain incompatibility. And furthermore, see how they are two sides of one coin. Gamma is incompatible with A, using the pound sign for that, says that commitment to accept all of gamma precludes entitlement to accept A. Accepting gamma precludes entitlement to accept A. That's the notion of incompatibility that I gave you. And it's exactly parallel to the definition of implication that we get in Restall-Ripley bilateralism if we put it in terms of commitment and preclusion to entitlement. And the fact that we're using preclusion of entitlement is what makes me say that incompatibility is the basic idea here. It's that commitments preclude entitlement to other commitments. But you get reasons for if what they preclude is entitlement to reject, and you get reasons against if what they preclude is entitlement to accept. And then here for a final move, say, well, now, wait a minute, I thought implication idea we sort of came in before you made all of these fancy distinctions was if you're committed to the premises, then you're committed to the conclusion and to accept the conclusion. And incompatibility would be if you're committed to the premises and they're incompatible with the conclusion, then you're committed to reject the conclusion. Wasn't that the intuitive idea we started with? And I say, okay, we can make sense of that because we can define a notion of pragmatically implicit attitudes and say that if you're precluded from entitlement to reject A, as you are in the implication, that's implicitly being committed to accept it. Because acceptance is the only attitude that you could ever be entitled to. You're precluded from being entitled to reject it. So the only option open to you, the only one you could be entitled to, is to accept it. Now, you don't need to take a stand. You don't need to accept or reject. That's important to Ripley. And that's why this is only implicit commitment. Your options have been narrowed so that the only option that you could be entitled to would be acceptance. And similarly, to be precluded from entitlement to accept A, as you are by something incompatible, is to be implicitly committed to reject A, because accepting A has been ruled out. You can't be entitled to that. The only thing you could be entitled to is rejection. So we can say, if we're speaking strictly about what commitments you're entitled to, implication says commitment to accept all of A precludes entitlement to a commitment to reject A, but implicitly, that's committing you to accept A. And there's space between the explicit and the implicit here. You might not take a stand at all. So this finer grain bilateralism that I'm proposing models both of the reason relations on incompatibility. I guess there's one other thing I want to say before we take our break. Isn't it, if you imagine Smiley or Rumfit looking at this, they'd say, haven't you expressively restricted yourself? All of you are our bilateralists who are bilateralists about the turnstile. Haven't you expressively restricted yourself by only allowing commitment to accept premises on the left side? Shouldn't we want to know what follows in either of these sense, what the reason relations are of a mixed set of acceptance and rejections, of commitment to accept and commitment to reject? After all, in our single succedent Smiley Rumfit systems, we get a lot of mileage out of that. And all I can do is issue a promissory note, make a gesture here, and say, we're going to define logical negation from incompatibility if gamma is incoherent, if gamma is incompatible with A, then it implies not A. That's basically going to be the principle. And using that, we can get the effect of having commitments to reject in the premises by having commitments to accept negations. And we'll see that we don't get anything new that way. So it actually will be possible to prove that we don't lose any expressive power by only considering relations of implication and incompatibility that are exclusively have as their premises commitments to accept. Okay, why don't you chew that over a little in the break? We'll come back at 2:51. Welcome back, everybody. So, the story that I told was how one can deepen and give a finer grained bilateralist account, not only of implication, but of its sister reason relation incompatibility in a way that shows the parallel between them, why the bivalence of attitudes and acts brings with it a bivalence of reason relations, of reasons for and reasons against, that those two bivalences are two sides of one coin. They come together in this conceptual framework, which connects commitments to preclusions of entitlement to commitment, which is the fundamental incompatibility structure. In the appendix to one of the chapters in Between Saying and Doing, I offer an incompatibility semantics for an S5 modal logic. I now think that what I was crudely reaching for there is this sense in which incompatibility is the pragmatic core of reason relations. But I appreciate that was a lot of material coming at you fast. Are there questions or comments at this point before we go on to McFarlane? Okay. So I said that, we're going to look at a sophisticated version of bilateralist explanation of reason relations in terms of a normative pragmatic metavocabulary. That's that first arrow in the mandala. But that then McFarlane asks about the other question. He says, suppose we were just given by an oracle facts about what followed from what. He's not thinking about incompatibility, but the paradigm is implication. Suppose we were just given those. Harman tells us we've got to separate that from norms governing what we should do in the way of the attitudes that we adopt. This is all downstream from the Harman point. But what exactly is the sort of constraint, normative constraint, that we should understand reason relations, my term, not his, facts about what follows from what, the validity of implications, he says. Just what norms of reasoning, what normative significance do they have? So he sort of wants to go the other way. Suppose we were given the reason relations. And this is a good test for the account we've given. If the account in the direction we pursued is a good one, then it ought to satisfy any reasonable set of constraints in going the other way. Let me mention in passing, last week I recommended Hannah Ginsburg's treatment of the normativity of concept use. She, like McFarlane, longtime Berkeley professors, they've each served as chair there. McFarlane, unlike Ginsburg, is a proud Pittsburgh product. I supervised his dissertation. This is all, long after that. McFarlane has an enviable and unusual position in contemporary philosophy. He barely publishes his papers. You really have to beg him to do it. He just puts them on his website, and they're important enough that everybody talks about them. This is a version of I don't know how the future could be without our needing to go through the various bottlenecks that there are otherwise, but there's only a few people who can count on getting an audience that way. So he says he's talking about logic. In what sense is logic normative for thought? But nothing actually nothing in his argument turns on the notion of consequence or implication that he's using being logical consequence or implication. So we can see it as being about reason relations in general. And here I've put the main parts of his argument on the handout. So his statement of the question, how do facts about, I'd say, the goodness of implications rather than the validity of inferences relate to norms for reasoning? Let me say in passing that validity was originally introduced as an English translation of Kant's Gültigkeit, which means the bindingness of the goodness of something, and has come to mean necessary truth preservingness of in a logical context. And so people often use that term validity. I think it's better just to talk about the goodness of it, and logical validity is a way in which an implication can be good. So I should say that this essay of McFarlane's is a paradigm of one way to write a superb philosophy paper. He sets out a botanization, a systematic, motivated botanization of the alternatives, lays out a list of criteria of adequacy for a solution, and systematically measures everything in the botanization, all the options against these criteria of adequacy, with discussions of the issues that come up along the way, and comes up with, well, this is what seems to survive and meet these criteria of adequacy. So this is a tour de force in a way, altogether admirable. So he says we need a bridge principle of the following form. If A, B, turnstile C, he uses the equal sign instead of my friendly snake, but it doesn't matter. Then normative claim about believing A, B, and C. Now, believing, that's not cutting as fine as what we've got. But if you look, okay. But if we look at polarity, that's one of the parameters that he's varying. Are these obligations, permissions, reasons to believe, or merely not to disbelieve? And he says disbelief is not just not believing, it's an actual attitude. You might neither believe nor disbelieve. Really, belief is standing in for commitment here, and commitment to accept, and disbelief for a commitment to reject. So his talk about belief is not as indiscriminate as it looks. He's got the bivalence of the attitudes in there. He's not discriminating commitments from entitlements, though if anyone has a black belt in the idiom of making it explicit, it is John McFarlane. One of the things you'll find on his website is his computer program, Gogar, game of giving and asking for reasons. It's just he didn't find that apparatus helpful here. So he considers these three dimensions, parameters that we can vary to get a set of options. What's the type of deontic operator governing the normative claim, obligations, permission, or just reasons? So that's going to be the O, the P, and the R in his list of options. The polarity, to believe or not to disbelieve, that is to accept or to reject, we can say. Here, scope of the deontic operator. These norms are in some sense conditional. He's thinking of, well, normative claim, if something about your attitude towards A and B, then something about your attitude towards C. But how does that go? And so he's considering, does the operator only apply to the consequent? If you accept or have some attitude towards the premises, then you ought or have some other attitude towards the conclusion. Or is it both of them? You ought, if you have this attitude toward the premises, have this attitude toward the conclusion. Is that right? Yeah, or is it the whole conditional? So it should be. If you have one normative attitude toward the premises, should you have another normative attitude toward the conclusion, or is there one normative attitude that governs the whole conditional? And so in table 1, he gives us the 18 alternatives that you get, deploying those. And in fact, he doubles those to 36 because he considers whether he can throw in a factive knows that as part of the attitude there. I've just divided through by that, not that no issues are raised by that, but they don't matter for us. That's the minus K thing. And then the considerations for assessing them, and now these are coming from parts of the, his starting point is bits of the original Harman discussion that I haven't talked about. Excessive demands. Is it completely impossible for anybody to do what a given principle would tell them to do? One of the versions requires that if you accept the axioms of Peano arithmetic, you believe all of mathematics. The paradox of the preface, the strictness test. I skipped 4, which is about knowledge, and logical obtuseness. Surely there's some obligation to, believe the consequences of what you believe. Now, after setting this up, obviously there's a lot of philosophical work that's going on in saying how these not just motivating ththese criteria of adequacy, but then assessing the different proposals according to them. I'm not going to go through any of that. It's in the article. Look at it. There's a huge literature downstream from this because a lot of arguments need to be made, and people look at their favorite one and his particular argument against that and say, no, I can defend that. But in the end, his own conclusion is some combination of these two principles. You ought to see to it that if you believe A and you believe B, you do not disbelieve C. And you have reason to see to it that if you believe that A and you believe that B, you believe that C. Now, those are good conclusions. I want to say those are recognizably versions of already the Restall-Ripley bilateralist versions. That is, the deontic operator applies to the whole position that you're in, as it does in Restall-Ripley. And the first one is saying, if you believe the premises, you should not disbelieve the conclusion. That's essentially, in his idiom, that's essentially the Restall-Ripley version of the normative situation that they say is expressed by an implication. And the second one, which has the positive obligation to believe that C, that's the version that I described as, that I articulated using the notion of pragmatically implicit commitments. That if commitment to accept all the premises precludes entitlement to reject the conclusion, then the only position it's left that you have any chance of being entitled to is accepting it. And that's a weaker notion than explicit commitment. But it's a genuine normative status that you're in, that the only position left open to you to be entitled to is the commitment. There isn't really a Restall-Ripley version of that. But the short conclusion I want to come to is that the version that I've offered of the more deontically fine-grained version of Restall-Ripley bilateralism satisfies the criteria of adequacy that Macfarlane has, with great precision, extracted from his large table of alternatives. As I say, he's using slightly different deontic notions. I think in some dimensions, cruder ones than I'm using, though there may be others along which he's cutting finer. And I would urge, as a recommending feature of the way I've set things up, the deontically two-dimensional version of Restall-Ripley bilateralism, is that the account goes through for the reason relation of incompatibility equally as well as it does for implication, in keeping with, as I said, most philosophers of logic. He doesn't explicitly consider incompatibility. He'd have needed to go through, all 18 or 36 alternatives again. But the account I gave is going to be equally responsive to the considerations that he's offering here. So I think both arrows work well, so I claim, and accordingly that we can trust an understanding of reason relations in terms of commitments and entitlements of the sort that at the end of part 1 there on the bottom of page 3, I've offered. Now, that obviously you'll have to assess for yourselves, but I've given you all the sort of raw materials. McFarlane's argument is there. You see how the bilateralism works and how the fancier version of the bilateralism works. But I take it that, I'm showing a connection between these two bits of the contemporary literature, the bilateralist Restall stuff, and this key move in the discussion of the normativity of logic or of reason relations. So, though the particular motivations for the line we're running in the book, Reasons for Logic, Logic for Reasons, is idiosyncratic to us, in fact, we're making just the sort of contact with major moves in the contemporary literature that one would hope to. So, where we're going with this now is, I claim we're entitled to talk about reason relations of implication and incompatibility, and understand how those are both rooted in and intelligible in terms of practices of giving and asking for reasons, making claims, defending and challenging those claims by giving reasons for them and reasons against them. So we've connected reasons, reasoning, and reason relations here. And now I want to turn and look to the structure and nature of reason relations. Once we've got this topic on the table, and begin to assemble the considerations that will let us compare them to logical relations of implication, deductive consequence, and inconsistency, which is the logical version of incompatibility. You only have inconsistency if you have negation. None of the discussion in these first 2 substantive weeks on pragmatics has required the use of any logical vocabulary. We're just talking about the use of a pre-logical or a non-logical language. We're still shaping up to introduce logical vocabulary into it. The general line, as I said in the introduction, is that what makes something a bit of logical vocabulary is that you can introduce it into a language that doesn't have that vocabulary to make explicit the reason relations, where making explicit is putting into the form of a claimable, of something you can assert or deny, something that itself stands in reason relations to other claims. So that the very reason relations of implication and incompatibility, in virtue of which I want to claim the claimables are the claimables they are, have the contents that they do, those can be brought into the game of giving and asking for reasons as things you can give and ask for reasons for and against. And so can be the explicit topic of argument. Logic is the organ of semantic self-consciousness is the slogan that I will be trying to fulfill. So what we'll be looking at in the next 2 weeks is what can we say about these reason relations before we've got logic on board? What is it that we're trying to make explicit? We sort of understand them, but in particular, what structure do they have? Are they transitive? Are they monotonic? And so on. So that's where we're going. So I claim we're at the end of that first arrow, the one that takes us into the center of the mandala to the reason relations. Okay, well, let me pause there. Okay. Well, this was the first substantive sort of portion of the book manuscript that we addressed. And I hope you can see how it's filling in the promissory notes that are implicit in that mandala. At least that one arrow should mean a lot more to you now than it did when you first saw it. And we've got to dwell a little in the central region in preparation for worrying about that next arrow, that vertical arrow. Okay, well then, be well, and I will see you next time.